the team at Brompton, and particularly Will Butler-Adams, who will be speaking shortly, for helping this inquiry take place. And massive thanks to Tom Cohen for pulling together the very vast amount of evidence that was provided. So thank you to everyone who has participated and made the report possible. I'm not going to steal Tom's thunder by going into the findings at this point in time, but I'm going to start by just handing over to Will Butler-Adams for his introductory remarks. Will, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are really excited by having this launched, and we've just been down outside taking a few photographs, and we've actually had a bit of fun trying to get the Bromptons into Portcullis House. So I'm quite glad I'm with you, because we've been herring upstairs just to get here in the nick of time. But really, we've seen, I mean, we've all seen it in the UK, but we've seen it globally. We're selling our bikes in 47 countries around the world. And, you know, 2 years ago, we were finding the world sort of pulling itself apart with its individualism, but we've all been through something pretty terrible in the last 18 months, which has affected the entire globe and still is affecting the globe at a time when we're facing enormous challenges beyond COVID, be they a climate emergency, mental health, physical health challenges. And, you know, I've been standing on the soapbox for 20 years, and everybody's walking past this fruitcake with his funny little folding bike, and they're trotting down the hole in the ground, you know, getting rammed in with a load of other grumpy people. And I'm standing there going, you nutters, what are you doing? You've got a beautiful city and you should be enjoying the city. And down they go. But incredibly, after 19 years of rabbiting on, things are changing. People are suddenly listening. Suddenly leaders, city mayors, politicians, the penny's beginning to drop. And this little thing, the bicycle, something that we were all born with, our legs, are being considered as real modes of transport, particularly as most of us live in cities and the distances we're traveling are small. And we've experienced in COVID a sort of enlightenment. We had a period in lockdown where cities were delightful places to live, where suddenly, you know, there wasn't noise pollution, where you didn't have to grab onto your child's arm wondering if they're going to scoot across and get into trouble and get hurt, injured, or killed. And that's not going to go away. And I think this report is so timely because we're talking about it, we can see it, but we need to turn it into tangible, practical solutions that can be implemented across England to try and take this momentum and run with it and really have a long-lasting legacy. So we're really excited to support it. A lot of it I can understand. Some of it, I'm afraid, is only in Tom's department because it's beyond my pay grade. But I've really enjoyed being part of it. And I hope, really hope, that it will garner some momentum and will result in some really tangible change.
Thank you very much, Will, for those thoughts. And obviously, we're aware the government has shown ambition in active travel and unprecedented investment. So it's really important moving forward that we are actually, you know, take the targets and funding structure to actually match the words that have come out. So I'm delighted at this point to hand over to Tom Cohen to go through some of the findings from the report. And then there will be a Q&A section. So if you have got questions, please do use either the Q&A function or just type them in the chat. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Selene. I am just waiting in classic Zoom terms for the rights to share my screen, but I hope that they will be granted shortly and then we'll be off.
You should have a green share screen button at the bottom of your screen.
I do, but at the moment the host has disabled my screen sharing. Which is not to say that the slides are desperately interesting, but I have prepared them and so it'd be nice to share them with you. Perhaps what we shall do is I'll just make a start and just with the verbiage, and maybe I can jump into the
Yeah, you can share your slides now, Tom.
Thanks very much, Anna. Right. And in the tradition of Zoom again, I shall ask Selene to give me a thumbs up that my slides are visible. And we're off. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, so as you know, this is an an inquiry which went by the name of Reaching Our Active Travel Potential, but as Selene said, it was set up with the Cycling and Walking Investment Strategy 2 in mind. We launched it on the 15th of June, and we allowed a month for people to submit written evidence. So we received evidence until the 16th of July. And we also had 3 virtual hearings. I just want to show you. There's just up there on the slide, the people who attended our first and second hearings. And what we were trying to do, obviously, we very much wanted the voices of the English active travel community to be present, but we also wanted to bring in some voices that perhaps are not typically heard when talking about active travel, but people and organizations whose expertise is very much relevant to the issues at hand. This next slide shows you the people who participated in our third hearing. So, for example, we had organizations such as the National Audit Office and the National Infrastructure Commission, who in the event were unable to give evidence at a hearing, but who gave written evidence, which was really helpful to what we were doing. And overall, we received written evidence from 25 organizations and 6 individuals. And I don't need to tell you that it was very rich, it was very diverse, and it gave us an enormous amount to go on. It's also worth saying, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear this, that the evidence ranged far beyond the narrow concept merely of investment, and we were talking about a great deal besides. What we've tried to do in this report is to focus on investment, but not exclusively, so where it's warranted to go beyond, and you will see examples of that. So I'll turn now to the recommendations themselves, of which there are 26, but you'll be very relieved to know that I don't intend to go them one by one. I'll simply try to pick out some highlights as we go. And they're arranged under 10 themes, so we'll look at them thematically. The first actually sits above all of those themes, and it's a suggestion that it shouldn't be a cycling and walking investment strategy, but should instead be called the active travel investment strategy. The rationale for that, there are various arguments, but the ones I would pick out are first that it's more inclusive, because there are lots of people traveling actively who are neither walking or cycling. There is also the pragmatic argument that given that cycling isn't universally popular yet, it might make sense to avoid playing into the hands of those who have a beef with cycling. Active travel is something that almost all of us do almost every day to some extent. Right, now on to the thematics. You won't be surprised to see that we're starting with funding. So how much? 2 billion, as announced in Gear Change, is a lot of money, and there was universal jubilation about that. But there was also a realization that that's an excellent start and more is required, given what we think we need to achieve. How much? Well, that remains to be confirmed, and I'll talk a little bit about research necessary later on. But it's rumoured, it's discussed, it's suggested that £25 per person per year might be the kind of sum we're looking at long term. And we would need to ramp up to that because the average Transport and Highway Authority simply isn't in a position to spend that kind of money yet. The other significant thing on this slide is to talk about the 5-year settlement idea, because the message that came through loud and clear from the evidence was that local authorities can't handle the living from hand to mouth arrangements that they're very used to. And 5 years was picked on by almost everybody as being the kind of period that gives local authorities the certainty that they need to build teams, to progress. So that's the kind of timescale we're thinking about. Now, I'm going to skip over recommendations 4 to 6 in the interest of time, but let me assure you they're all very important too. Now on to targets, and there was generally agreement that targets are desirable and necessary, but what should those targets be? You will know that there are several already in play, and there was talk of whether there should be a target related to reducing car use, for example. Our conclusion after deliberating on this was that the best thing was to start with net zero. Why? Because it's legally binding and because it's time bound. So you've got something which is very hard to walk away from. From that net zero goal, you can work backwards and say, well, what level of motorized movement do you think there will be? What proportion of that is going to be fossil fuel based? And then it's possible to derive some kind of prediction of the volume of active travel necessary. There's more work to be done on that, but that seems to be a sensible starting point. If you start with those, then it needs to be cascaded down to the level of the Transport or Highway Authority. And here we're suggesting you start with a desk exercise. So you use topographical information, land use information to come up with an opening view of what a given authority ought to be able to achieve in terms of active travel. And this needs to reflect that Cumbria is not Birmingham. Different places have different attributes and therefore their capacity to build active travel will vary. Then what needs to happen, and this is the first emergence of Active Travel England for us, Active Travel England would broker a negotiation process where the local authority would take those starting numbers and agree on something which is acceptable to them, but which in aggregate, so if you take all of the local authorities together, would achieve the goals at the national level. I won't dwell on number 9 for now, but mobility justice is something which appears repeatedly throughout this set of recommendations. So I've talked about Active Travel England already. It's no exaggeration to say that amongst the people who gave evidence, there is a great deal of hope and excitement about Active Travel England, the feeling that it really could be a policy game changer. And so our recommendations: imagine, expect, hope for a very active Travel England, one with power and capacity and very much engaged in all aspects of the work. So quickly over these 3 recommendations that relate specifically to ATE, and there are others where ATE gets involved. So the first one, the idea of an active travel quality mark, is going to allow beacon authorities to be recognized, but that's in the context of a more general role for ATE, being a kind of champion and harbor of best practice. It would also hold on to these sums of money which would operate above a local authority level, so money for inclusive projects, national projects such as the NCN, and crucially, building our understanding of which interventions actually do succeed in building active travel. Some things work better than others. Our knowledge base is increasing all the time, but there are still huge gaps, and we need to understand better what does work. And the final one, 12, Active Travel England, we see as being a very welcome intermediary sitting between central and local government, helping to broker negotiations between the two, not being bullied by either. Moving on to network and program planning, here we introduce the concept of an active travel plan. So local highway authorities, transport authorities would produce an active travel plan. And this goes back to what we were saying about 5 years of money. This is where the authority says how they're going to spend those 5 years of money. So it would be detailed programs, again, reflecting this idea of ramping up. It's not going to be possible to do everything at full capacity from year 1. So gradually building speed and activity towards the end of that period. The significant thing here is to say that active travel plans will be a combination of capital and revenue measures. And this is something which hasn't tended to be coherently planned together in the past. But it's essential that they be planned together. If you're going to increase the quality of your network, you need to work out what your revenue activities are to make the most of those improvements. The assumption is that this would be very much linked in to the local transport plan, so that everything else the authority was doing in terms of transport was connected to the active travel plan too. And as well as everything I've already mentioned, there would have to be money sufficient to cover maintenance, to cover proper quality engagement, the monitoring of interventions as well. Very briefly, you'll be aware that Active Travel England is set out as being a statutory consultee in gear change for planning developments. And we're saying that's great. We think it should have teeth. And that is to say that Active Travel England would be able to refer matters to the Secretary of State if they were considered to be likely to lead to increased car dependency or to exclude the use of active travel. I don't want to dwell on this. You will already know from what I've said that there is this emphasis in the report already about local government needing to skill up at pace in order to be able to deliver what is required here. Perhaps slightly less obvious is recommendation 17 about how central government's role itself is changing too, and it therefore needs to develop its skills in order to perform its role. That means things like being a good portfolio manager as opposed to being a program manager. It's a subtle but important change. Also being better at sharing data. Under legislation and standards, number 18 was described by one of our witnesses as being an LTN 120 for pavements. And maybe that's something which the Manual for Streets in its new incarnation can do for us. So something which is asking very high standards of our pedestrian environments. I won't say much about the new standards for equity and engagement and consultation, but again, they play into what we were saying before about inclusion. Number 20 is going to excite many people, a new Highways Act, and I will simply quote from our report on what that might mean. To require highway authorities to develop and manage their networks in accordance with the need to achieve the goals of environmental sustainability and improve public health. And this reflects the fact that at the moment, highways authorities don't actually have very many duties. And as far as active travel is concerned, they have practically none. So this could be a game changer. On the front of influencing attitudes and behavior, as I said earlier, we know a certain amount about what does and doesn't work when trying to get people to walk and cycle, but we still need to know more. That said, authorities really need to be using what is understood, best practice, the state of knowledge in developing their programs. There are all sorts of interventions out there, some of which are being used almost as a reflex. Some of them are not being used because the data about them are not terribly strong. And what we need to do is try to inculcate an expectation that all programs will be based on the best understanding of what does and doesn't work. And that means planning carefully as well, not simply choosing the best interventions, but planning them in an inclusive and coordinated manner, engaging communities all the way along to avoid the kind of backlash that we saw in 2020. Under performance management, this might raise an eyebrow or two, in that we are adopting a help, not punishment attitude to authorities that are struggling. So I've told you already that the idea is that all local authorities will be testing challenging targets for active travel. And we can expect that some of them will do better than others in responding to those targets. Now, for those that are struggling, we suggest that, again, Active Travel England should be sent in to provide practical assistance. So we know about the idea of sin bins, taking your money away and so forth. That's all well and good, but that's not actually going to reduce carbon. What we need with those struggling authorities is to provide the kind of practical assistance that will turn them around. The obvious parallel is with Ofsted and struggling schools. Now, I really want to stop talking and let you ask questions, so I will pass over these knowledge gap points, apart from to say that they're all there in order to fill some of the needs that we've set out in earlier recommendations, so that the recommendations, when they're implemented, would be based on sound information and the best data available. So, as promised, I shall stop and hand back to Selene.
Thank you. Couldn't find my unmute button. Thanks, Tom, for going through that. And there are a number of questions coming in the chat. Thank you very much for those. And I think probably what I should say before going to the questions, just to clarify, obviously this is an all-party parliamentary group. We're not the Department of Transport, but I have shared the report with the Minister responsible. Even after the reshuffle, the right Minister does have a copy of the report ahead of this afternoon. And I will ensure that that I will do my part from my side of the house to make sure that ministers are on board. But I think it's important to recognise that this is an APPG and not the department when we come on to some of the questions. So the first question, I'm going to go down the list. Mark Strong has asked, what options are there to influence councils that either do not take walking and cycling seriously or remove existing schemes? Do you agree that the Department for Transport's current lever of just removing all active travel funding is a blunt instrument and it would be better to give teeth to the network management duty? Tom, are you happy with that one?
I'm very happy to answer. I think in a sense, I've already just answered it by talking about the idea of intervention to help struggling authorities rather than a stick to smack them. So perhaps I won't repeat what I've just said. This was what our witnesses told us would be the best way forward. Perhaps I can invite the parliamentarians to add anything to that they wish to.
Ruth, did you have anything you'd like to add? No, you're on mute, but I'll take that as a no. So moving on to from Ruth Maraka's question. He says, it is wonderful that there is a wake up to cycling and walking, but how will this work in practice? We know that all over the country, there are excellent schemes have been pulled out by councils in spite of those who cycle having applauded them. Any way to have a coherent cycling and walking policy is for it to be mandated. Is this being talked about? Plus that consultations must be cross-boundary to enable modal shift from driving to walking and cycling. So before I hand over to Ruth, I'm going to have a little go at part of that one, because as chair of the APPG, I actually represent a very rural constituency. I'm the MP for North Devon, and therefore cycling, although there's a lot of people do it for pleasure and some people do manage to get to work on their bikes, the journeys that people in my constituency travel are far greater than our cities, and therefore these multimodal solutions really are vital. And having hosted a climate summit myself at the weekend, one of the things that came through very loudly in the messaging from the experts was the most important thing is bringing people with you on the journey. And that's not always about actually mandating, but it is about inspiring and getting people on that journey. So I think that's very much sort of my feeling, is that we need to bring people with us, which is why I particularly like the idea of talking about this as active travel, because I know cycling is not universally popular, but to date walking hasn't been something that's widely discouraged. So Tom, can I hand over to you if you've got any other further points on Ruth's question?
Sure, happy to try. Okay, well, I would suggest that the approach we're proposing might be a good one, in that sense that no highway or transport authority will be able to walk away saying we're not interested. They will all be required to accept some fairly testing target for active travel based on this negotiation that we've discussed with Active Travel England. So I don't know whether that constitutes mandating, but it certainly means that all authorities, both the keen and the less keen, are going to have a job to do, and they can expect to be assessed on their performance. So one thing I didn't mention was the idea that the active travel plan will be subject to annual assessment, again, in association with Active Travel England. So local authorities that show really no enthusiasm for the task of growing active travel, well, I don't know whether it'll be a matter of them being sin bin, but they will become increasingly exposed as not doing their bit. And I have a feeling that that might have its own impact. The specific in Ruth's question, which is worth picking up, was this idea of consulting across boundaries. Here comes another mention of Active Travel England, but one of the ideas we had was that it could help with those knotty cross-boundary issues where local authorities don't necessarily agree on the best way forward. They can perhaps broker the pursuit of a mutually acceptable solution. And then I think this crucial point of engagement, it's something which has come up again and again. And so that means central government giving local authorities enough money to recruit the relevant people and the skills to do engagement to the necessary high standard. That's why we have proposed a standard for engagement. It's not going to be satisfactory from now on simply to say, oh, well, we sent out the leaflet. Engagement will have to be done to a really high standard. And there is this expectation, and I hope it's shared by most people on the call, that if you get it right, active travel doesn't need to be as toxic as it has been in the past. And communities more generally will become more sympathetic when they see that these schemes are about helping them to make journeys. And that's the us and them part of this has to go. And hopefully some of the recommendations in the report are going to be helpful in taking away that adversarial history of active travel, which is so unhelpful.
Can I come in here? Because I think both Mark and Ruth Mayorkas's questions, in terms of local authorities that aren't, shall we say, forward thinking on providing space for walking and cycling. And I think looking at my own area in Hounslow Borough, it's been hugely controversial. Low traffic neighbourhoods and a segregated cycle path have been hugely controversial in one part of the borough, in an area where there's a lot of public engagement in local issues, online and in particular. So as I say, the walking and cycling initiatives, which have been brought forward a lot faster because of the government's gear change programme over the last year. But in the rest of the borough, I'm getting very little flack. There's very little in the local press, and frankly, I'm not getting a lot of negative emails or calls about them. I think about 30 schools in the borough have got school streets now, or various arrangements around the school. It's certainly helped that a lot of Hounslow's cycling low traffic streets have been enabled not through physical barriers but ANPR, so that residents aren't blocked who need to have to get in and out in vehicles. They're not blocked in the wrong side of a barrier, and I think that's helped a lot. But I wasn't around in the Netherlands in the 70s, which saw the transformation from a car-borne society to a walking and cycling and public transport society. But I would imagine it was lumpy. I would imagine there was opposition in some places to some initiatives. And I think this is about getting the ball rolling, showing that it works. And certainly in my history in local government with parking schemes, some of them are very unpopular when they're proposed, but once they're in, nobody wants to remove them. And I think, I like to think that will be the case, that once schemes go in, other areas, other communities, other councillors go, oh, well, if it worked there, maybe we should try it here. So I think we're on a journey. I think the government gave the journey a huge kickstart last year. And our report, as Selene has said, we're a group of parliamentarians. We're not the decision makers in government. But we hope that our report helps government, the transport ministers and the Department for Transport and the other departments where this applies to. We hope that it'll help them, and we're sharing this with the active travel world, with the local government world, and of course with our fellow members of parliament and peers in the House of Lords as well.
Thank you, Ruth, for picking that up. And Will, if you're still there, question for Will from Adam: what can the government do to support businesses in active travel?
It's quite interesting. The businesses that we work with, again, UK and global, there is increasing awareness, just like we had 30 years ago, where people started with HR policies. That was a novel idea. And then more recently, we've had CSR. There is a drive, not just from the staff themselves, but also from the customers who are engaging in those businesses to support businesses that are supporting their staff with more active travel. So we're sort of pushing on an open door. The experience that we've had has been that the businesses are very keen, but something that somebody has mentioned in some of the comments, an important part which wasn't covered by this report, but is very important if we're really going to transform our towns and cities across the UK, is to engage developers, because developers play a large part in redefining how cityscape will work. And at the moment, we have some quite peculiar planning laws that in many cases have stopped us when we've worked with developers for doing really innovative new programs to try and stimulate and encourage more active travel. And all we're allowed to do is put in Sheffield stands, and we want to do radically cool things. So I think, I think as Ruth said, we're on a journey. It's not going to be perfect. It will have bumps in the road, but we need to just keep pushing forward and making solid steps. There are loads of other things we need to do, but for me, we are moving at a speed with a sense of urgency and seriousness that we haven't seen in a generation. So for the moment, let's get what we can and bag it, but there is plenty more behind it.
May I just add something there, Selene, because I think
yeah, of course. Thanks, Tom.
Will makes excellent points. I just wanted to add something I skipped over just in the interest of time, was the idea that the government would provide a certain amount of money to help the active travel industry in England develop and flourish. And exactly what form that would take obviously needs to be determined, but that might be sums to enable incubation or to assist particular sectors in moving forward. And that could be in manufacture, but it doesn't need to be that. It can also be in professional services. Just in addition, I think Will makes a good point about developers, and perhaps the recommendation about active travel and land use planning is on the negative side, in that the idea is that Active Travel England will be able to intervene effectively where developments are particularly hostile to active travel or likely to foster car dependency. And maybe that's something which we can go away and think about for the future, is ways of engaging more positively as well with the developer community in order to bring out good practice as well as to try to stifle bad practice.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. So the question from Neil, that the Bike Nation report suggested that the best impact is when all interventions come together at the same time. The report seems to support that. Does Tom agree?
Yes. I'm sorry, I only paused because I'm thinking as a researcher by profession that those sorts of unqualified answers are always a little bit dangerous. Yes, on the whole, you need to do everything together, but that doesn't mean a hodgepodge. It does still mean carefully planned combinations of capital and revenue. It means choosing the most effective forms of communications tools, doing cycle training in the right way and in the right places, and so forth. So an integrated package, definitely, but not one planned on the hoof, definitely one which has been planned on the basis of the best evidence concerning what works.
Thank you. I've got a sort of set of questions here, which I'm not sure that we can answer, but if we cover them all off together, because they're linked into the Department for Transport, which I'm not sure that any of us are fully qualified to speak on. And I've got a couple from Claire, who mentions that who asks, how does this set of recommendations sit with the Department for Transport decarbonisation plan, which seems to hero the local transport plan as the funding mechanism? That would be how councils were expected to outline integrated plans that deliver net zero for walking and cycling. And then Claire also asks if we would comment on the current internal disagreement inside the Department for Transport that Active Travel England will just be a sub-department rather than its own agency. And then we had a further question from Lucy, who asks whether ATE or the Department for Transport will take over failing authorities in the way failing hospitals might be taken over centrally. So Tom, I'm not sure if you feel you can comment, or whether Ruth's got any views from the Transport Select Committee, or whether we have a view as an APPG, which we haven't pre-agreed. Over to you, Tom.
Well, I'll happily start, but I think I will be exceeding my brief within a matter of seconds. With regard to decarbonisation, it's perhaps fair to say that this report has ploughed its own furrow, as in not necessarily taking a view on the electric vehicle debate, but simply saying, we are proposing that active travel targets be based on net zero, which is the common theme, and then some justifiable assumptions concerning the volume of movement and how that movement might take place. So I think that the decarbonisation agenda has got a long way to go in terms of acquiring detail and taking the necessary shape. Meanwhile, the active travel community can't wait around. We've just got to press on with what we know we need to do, which is massive expansion. With regard to Active Travel England's role, well, it's very apparent, I'm sure, from what we've said already, that we see Active Travel England being most effective if it's given real welly. And that isn't just a matter of resources, but some independence. And there are examples already in the transport sector of organizations that have been that much more successful for being a little bit removed from central government. So National Highways is the obvious one, Network Rail is another. So Active Travel England wouldn't be the first if it were allowed to perform that kind of function. And it's hard to see how the quite ambitious ideas we have for Active Travel England could come about if it were simply a flaw in Great Minster House. Yes, that acid question about whether the government would take over failing authorities, I suppose it's inevitable that question must be asked. There, you can conduct the thought experiment and imagine a local authority that has kicked and screamed, it's resisted active travel targets, it's not doing the right things in order to make progress towards them. Active Travel England has done everything it can to bring them along, to try to convince them that this is the right path to follow, and they're still resisting. It's probably not for me to say, but it seems to me plausible that that might be a necessary step.
Thank you, Tom. Ruth, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I wanted to just touch on the role, the status of Active Travel England, and you know, our report does say that AT should have you know, some powers and some respect within government, and as others have already touched on, the aims and objectives of getting more people travelling actively benefits not just the transport network, isn't just a transport issue, but it's a health issue, obesity, and you know, and obviously you know, working towards zero carbon. So if Active Travel England had some standalone authority, I think it would be stronger. And you know, I regret that you know, we used to have a Quango, I suppose it was called, Cycling England, back in the noughties, and it was abolished in the bonfire of the Quangos in 2010. And it was only just sort of getting off the ground, and you know, but you know, it was doing some really good stuff, and particularly collecting best practice, and it had a status. So you know, certainly our report does touch on the kind of level of authority that Active Travel England should have, and be able to work across the piece, and particularly with local government, and try and get away from the what we see too often with government action, is that it gets stuck in the different silos of the different departments.
Hopefully we will unsilo it. Lord Berkeley is on the call. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Who says, this sounds to be a really useful and interesting report. Thank you very much. Ministers seem to be getting into a state over e-scooters, which to me are as close to being an electric bike as anything else. Do we presume that we see e-scooters and any other similar means of active travel are included as active travel? Either way, he observes that as people need charging points for their cars, they need somewhere to store their bikes and scooters at home and work, etc. So another planning issue. Do you have any comments for Lord Berkeley?
Again, I feel I'm about to exceed my brief, but it's very topical, because colleagues and I have been discussing for some time the question of whether e-scooters should be counted as active travel. I'll go out on a limb and say I think they aren't active travel. I realise that is a minority view, and I certainly don't want to start a spat. But one of the advantages of recommending active travel as the nomenclature is that we allow ourselves the space to have that discussion, and to allow such modes as we conclude are active travel to be part of the story. And therefore it doesn't really matter whether I think e-scooters are active or not. A wider discussion can reach conclusions which will then determine the overarching policy. Also implicit in Lord Berkeley's question was this issue of where people put and charge these vehicles, whatever form they might take. And this obviously is crucial. It's not something I mentioned specifically, but active travel plans will be expected to cover all of those things. So in the same way that they need to address issues of the network, they need to provide for storage and charging where appropriate at both ends of the journey, because those things are all part of the essential chain that enables travel by active modes.
Thanks, Tom. And Will's got his hand up. Will, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we've obviously put a bit of thought into scooters, and our conclusion is, I mean, this is completely off brief. It's slightly aligned with Tom, which is they're not actually active, but they're great, because trying to get somebody out of a car or out from under the ground when they've grown up using a car or the tube to get around, versus somebody who is on a little whizzy platform that takes them down cycle lanes, that allows them to get to know their city, that makes them realize that the weather isn't as bad as they thought, and that this is really fun. But you know, when they hit 30 and two of their friends have broken their arms, a couple of them have smashed their front teeth out, and they're finding that they're having to let their belt out one or two bits, they might think, well, maybe I'm going to give up on the scooter and I'll get on a bicycle. So, you know, I think in this weird world of transport, it's a massive step forward. I think it's all part of the mix. It's disruptive, it's positive, it's not perfect. I don't think twisting your wrist is quite active, but it forms part of this great mixture and interesting development of how we get about in our towns and cities. So, you know, I'm supportive, but it's going to form part of this evolution into more active travel, I think.
Thanks, Will. I was thinking about it. I'm going to hand over to Ruth, but on my drive in today, watching them come down at me, and I concluded it was active because they were at least standing up rather than sitting down. And as a former fitness instructor, every time you can get someone to stand up is a good thing. So Ruth, did you have something to add?
Well, yes, I mean, you can have a philosophical discussion about whether an e-scooter is active or not, or you can look at the transport in a city or a town or a village and look at how people are moving. Are they sitting in cars causing congestion, causing pollution, going at 11 miles an hour on average, which I think was the pre-pandemic average speed for the whole of Greater London, including Outer London. So for some of the town centres in London and central London, the average vehicular speeds must have been a lot lower. And the reality is, whether you're cycling, walking off, well, if you're cycling or on an e-bike or on an e-scooter, you're going to get around a lot quicker, or if you're on the public transport and walking in between trams or tube stations or whatever. So, you know, and they're not going to go away. They are ridden irresponsibly and often generally illegally, because you can only legally ride an e-scooter in this country at the moment if you're using one of the rental schemes. So they are part of the mix, and if we're only going to, like bikes, adults riding bikes, we're only going to get them off the pavements if there's safe space to cycle. And for many key routes, especially where there's busy pavements, we've got to get e-bikes, e-scooters and bikes off the pavement, but also away from heavy traffic as well. So they need to be considered as part of the mix. At the moment we're in a trial period with the rental scooters. Many other cities around the world and countries around the world have legalized them, but there are expectations in those countries for the behaviour of the riders. So that's the next stage that I think the government's got to grapple with e-scooters.
Thanks very much, Ruth. And sort of leading on from that, an interesting question from, so hopefully that answered Lord Young's question as well, but leading on to Robert Murphy's questions, he said, how do we better obtain all community views and not just the passionately supportive and the vehemently opposed, which is important to give politicians more confidence in making difficult but necessary decisions? And a sort of related question from Mark Strong is, how would we start to address the general negative attitude by the media, especially the local press, which exacerbates the antagonism to active travel? Tom, what do you think about those two?
Well, this is a subject dear to my heart, and it's something that we have worked on during the year already. So going back to our recommendation that there should be a standard on engagement, one of the principles of that standard would be truly inclusive planning. And that means engaging all aspects of the community, including those who wouldn't automatically find their way into the conversation. And those will often be people who don't feel strongly either way, or people who feel pressed for time, who have lots of other things to worry about and wouldn't necessarily respond to the kinds of consultation that we tend to put out. So that would be my primary answer to the question, is that good engagement means a very active attempt to bring all voices to bear in a conversation. And it's worth saying, as part of that, that should include underrepresented groups generally, and this picks up the very strong theme of inclusion and equity that runs through the report in general. As to the press, well, that's probably less my area of expertise. There's nothing we can do about the fact that newspapers thrive on controversy. That's what people are drawn to. And this is something which has been further exemplified by social media and the internet more generally. I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. So it may be that we can hope in vain for local authorities, for local newspapers suddenly to start saying, marvelous, huge amounts of harmony relating to active travel plans in city X. Well, it might happen, but I think that we may as well accept that there will be an ongoing appetite for finding the disagreement where it's to be had.
Thank you very much. And you started to touch on this, so I thought I'd bring in Kay's question, who said she's really pleased to see point 6, a fair deal for disabled cyclists. Could we flesh out some of the practical interventions that might involve?
Gladly. And yes, apologies for not spending enough time on that to say more. Okay, 2 specific proposals. One is the Motability scheme being expanded. Those on the call who are familiar with it will know that it enables access to a whole range of vehicles, except cycles for people with disabilities. And so a simple fix would be to expand Motability so that it did embrace such types of cycle. The other thing which we specifically propose is to allow VAT exemption for the purchase of cycles for people with disabilities to use them for mobility purposes.
Thanks, Tom. And while we're on excluded groups, Lucy has asked about children who are routinely, she says, sidelined and excluded as a result of transport practices and highways engineering habits. In terms of levelling up and mobility justice, Lucy thinks authorities should have to measure inclusive cycling so that authorities' success is assessed in terms of the age, gender and disability of those cycling and walking rather than simply measuring overall levels of cycling and walking, and wonders whether that's included in the report.
Well, it is, Lucy, but I have to say that we say in the report that we're probably a couple of years off being ready to set targets for mobility justice, but recommendation 9 is to develop national targets for mobility justice in active travel, reflecting exactly that sort of consideration. But the evidence from our witnesses was that we're not there yet. But we shouldn't just blunder ahead and start saying X% or Y%. We need to do a bit more research in order to understand the barriers to people who are excluded from active travel and what needs to be done to address them. Having done that work, I think it becomes eminently possible to start setting targets of that kind. And then I suppose in practical terms, it's worth referring to another recommendation, which I'll just bring up on the screen in front of me. I didn't mention this again in passing, but the recommendation 14 talks about local cycling and walking infrastructure plans to provide a coherent, balanced active travel network that includes right-of-way. What's not implicit in that specific statement is the idea that LCWIPs, as they tend normally to be called, need to move beyond a quite understandable preoccupation with the commute and start addressing the full range of journeys that people might need to make by active travel. And in particular, that needs to address journeys which are invisible because someone is currently blocked from making that journey because of things which may not be completely understood. So a more inclusive approach to LCWIPs might do a better job of addressing the journey making of young people and all manner of other underrepresented groups.
Thanks, Tom. And while we're talking about LCWIPs, Frank asked earlier how they can be accurately developed when in town centres much depends on future building developments, the outcomes of which are unknown.
An entirely fair question. And I think the answer is it's not easy, but it does rely on, well, start at the beginning, give local authorities a decent level of resource and some skilled individuals who can take this work forward, because that's what so few transport and highway authorities are able to do at the moment. Once you've got a team of people who have the resource to engage actively with the developer community, to keep a very close eye on the local plan, it becomes easier to say, well, we think these things are coming, or we know that those things are coming and therefore we need to allow for them. That's not going to remove the fact that planning remains full of intangibles and imponderables, but it certainly reduces the risk that an LCWIP is going to be developed on the basis of what turns out to be an entirely inaccurate representation of land use 3 or 5 years from now. And I suppose the thing to add to that is that constant review is essential too. It's not a document that you produce in 2021 expecting it to be valid in 2029. It's something which needs to be a living document.
Thanks, Tom. Ruth, did you have anything you wanted to add? No. Okay, so moving on to David Harrison's question, who observed that in 2001, the Transport Committee stressed the importance of walking routes and recommended their development. What role do we see for them?
A massive role. Well, depending on what David means by a walking route, but it was pointed out in our evidence that, I think it was Living Streets who pointed out that in order to achieve the goal for urban areas in gear change, walking is going to be doing the bulk of the work. And for the simple reason that it currently represents a much larger share of overall travel. And that is likely to remain the case. So I hope that it's very clear from this report and from our recommendations that we very definitely see walking as fundamental to the growth of active travel. And it is cycling and walking and other modes, but walking is a massively important part of that. Back to LCWIPs, a good LCWIP is going to identify what needs to be done to the walking network as well as what needs to be done to the cycling network. Sometimes these things will coincide, sometimes they will be very different. And they will need to reflect the fact that walking and cycling have quite important differences in terms of their characteristics too. I fear that won't have answered David's question as fully as he would wish, but I think those are some of the points that are worth making on the theme.
And so Tom from LCC has asked, should all government departments and all local authorities follow the Transport for London lead on procuring only safe lorries which meet direct vision standards and only employ contractors who are signed up to Falls and Clocks safety standards? Any thoughts that we have on that?
It's a very fair question, and it's also worth saying that this was an area where we concluded that the inquiry didn't need to tread. As I said, we decided to range beyond investment, pure and simple, simply because there were various connected themes that it would have made no sense not to address as part of the report. But issues such as road safety, massively important as they are to the growth of active travel, seem to be something that we didn't need to address as fully in this report, because A, there are other streams of activity pursuing them, and B, the APPG has looked quite closely at road safety in the relatively recent past. So if you wanted a personal view, wouldn't be opposed to doing exactly what TfL does across the country, but it's not something that we address specifically in this piece of work.
Thanks, Tom. And we haven't got much more time left, so we'll see if we can zip through a few. This one's from Peter Murray, who says the National Design Code promoted active travel, connected networks of streets, good public transport, and the promotion of walking and cycling were key principles. What can the APPG do to ensure it survives Robert Jenrick's departure from MHCLG? And my first observation would be to wait until Mr. Gove's got his feet under the table and that red box out, and I don't mind going to ask him. But I don't know if Ruth or Tom have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think it goes back to my point before. If ATE had enough clout and was possibly an agency rather than an integral part of the department, but I think it's likely to have more would have more clout within what last week was called HCLG, because yeah, I mean, exactly, if walking and cycling, both capital and revenue spend and powers aren't, they have to be. It has to be delivered primarily through local authorities and local transport authorities. So I think, yeah, where it sits and the level of respect it has is absolutely essential. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Ruth. I'm going to do one more question before I hand over to you, Ruth, to close. From Adrian Lord, who says, one problem that we are encountering with a certain large item of national infrastructure is that the red line is very tightly defined. Would it be possible to ensure that all new road and rail infrastructure is fully integrated through route connections, enhancements into existing networks? Saying it's pointless to have a shiny new station if nobody can get to it due to a hostile major road network environment.
Well, I can try to respond to that. I can't imagine what scheme Adrian has in mind, but if I just set that to one side, well, to the extent that we address this, I would say it's the land use planning point that I already raised earlier, which is if things go according to plan, Active Travel England would be presented with proposals for example, stations, and invited to comment on whether they would work from an active travel perspective. And more broadly, I think it's fair to say. So maybe it's too much to say that this report provides a solution to massive infrastructure projects, though the fact that the National Infrastructure Commission wanted to contribute to this report seems to me to be a very positive sign. And it's more a case of Active Travel England being able to play a very positive and active role in commenting on and influencing proposals. And I just want to say one very brief thing before I shut up and let Ruth finish, which is that our objective in approaching this piece of work was to be constructive throughout, not to develop a stick to hit the Department of Transport with, but to try to provide helpful and positive ways of proceeding. And I hope that we've succeeded in that regard, because this is going to be about collaboration. The APPG can be helping the Department of Transport and associated ministries to do this work and to make the progress that needs to be made. And it's going to be achieved through collaboration, no question about that.
Thank you so much, Tom. And a link to the report is in the chat, so do make sure you copy and paste it. Apologies to everyone whose question we haven't got to, but I'm going to hand over to my co-chair, Ruth Cadbury, who's going to close. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you very much for your excellent chairing, Selene, and fielding the questions, all of which were really interesting, some of which went beyond the scope of the report into the cycling and walking investment strategy of government, or possibly should have been within our report but weren't because we had a relatively short time and Tom only had so many hours in the day to address, and of course we could only address what people had asked us to include or had told us at the sessions, at the 3 inquiry sessions. So clearly this is a really wide area, but we hope that with our recommendations focusing on a new Highway Act, increased resources for active travel, status for Active Travel England, active travel targets that are linked with net zero, and those are the 4 big recommendations, with Active Travel England having a seriously broad and substantial role. Those are the core recommendations, and hopefully, if the government is sympathetic to what we're saying and does start adopting those principles and funding, then a lot of the other points that people have quite rightly made, hopefully, will be able to fit in. And there was a specific recommendation that, in a way, illustrates the inconsistency of where we are at the moment, which I don't think we have time to mention today. But e-bikes are the only form of e-transport for which there's no subsidy to the purchaser. And that's an inconsistency that could easily be put right for relatively small money, and would take, if France is anything to go by, and I think Germany, would take many vehicles that are only ever used for short journeys off our roads. So I would like to close by, as I say, thanking Selene for chairing the bulk of the session today, for Tom for phenomenal amount of work putting this together and pulling together all the different views and perspectives into a coherent report with a clear set of recommendations. I'd like to thank Will Butler-Adams of Brompton Bikes for his support, his financial support for this report, and also his support in general. He's long been a supporter of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and we thank you, Will, for your continuing and ongoing support. And I know you've had a mixed 18 months, as have many manufacturers. So that's thank you for finding the time to come along today as well. I'd like to thank Adam Kaufman and Adam Tranter and Jack Mayorkas, who are our team behind the scenes of the APPG, for all that they do. And as I say, as Selene said, the link to the report is on our website, and we hope to see people at our future meetings.